Oops, either way. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I don't think my mom gives me as nice of an introduction to her friends. And I can't pronounce these words either. And also, thank you all for showing up, even though Brian dismissed the conference last night after dinner. I was just going to come in here and talk to the wall. I can still do that if you all want to leave. I'm fine with that. So I'd say understanding the physics of tornadogenesis are probably this huge holy grail in severe storms meteorology, certainly for hazard forecasting, right? You can't forecast a hazard if you don't have the slightest clue how it's going to start. But looks like there's a couple of talks coming up that are just going to handle all that for me. So I'll let them deal with that. I'm going to talk about, sorry about my folksy title, that stuff that happens in storms after a tornado forms. So
we added a light show for you, sir.
You're going to have a seizure up here.
It's our fans.
Okay.
It's fine.
There.
We'll do it 3 times.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the storm scale processes happening in supercells, basically immediately after tornadogenesis forms, and we'll kind of do some comparisons for how that may or may not be the same thing happening at tornadogenesis. So I'm trying an experiment here in color theory to see if I can find the most obnoxious colors that can still stand out. So basic components for a tornado, if you want to distill it down to the simplest, most components, you probably just need low-level vertical vorticity and then low-level updraft or convergence in order to contract angular momentum to tighter scales. Winds rotating pretty quickly. And we've all seen this schematic diagram now, 40 some odd years old, that dictates kind of the storm scale conditions that set this up. We're all severe storm nerds. We're highly familiar with this diagram. Anyone in the room have this tattooed on their body yet? Not judging. So your main mesocyclone area in here where the tornado is located is typically, in this classical sense, bifurcated with updraft and downdraft. The downdraft being that intense rear flank downdraft on the rear flank of the storm happening, and then the weaker forward flank downdraft, all dumping out this outflow that along the leading edge of it has the gust front that has the low-level updraft and convergence that eventually kind of feeds into the main mid to lowish level updraft and aloft. And if the tornado is going to form, it's going to form kind of right here near the tip of this sort of a collision point of these gust fronts. And many studies have shown that the initial rotation at low levels, mesocyclone and or tornado, come from parcels that are coming in from the inflow environment kind of out where I'm standing, and they tend to come through this forward flank baroclinic region, pick up horizontal vorticity through baroclinic generation that is tilted and stretched by updraft, the main updraft area at levels. And this diagram's held up pretty well, certainly over the last 40 years. I'd say over the last 15 or so years, as we've had a lot more high-resolution radar observations, in situ observations in the rear flank, and also lots of higher and higher resolution simulations have found even some more details that Lemon and Doswell didn't really know about 40 years ago based on the observations that they had. In particular, one that seems to be relatively sexy in the last 15 or so years is the idea that there are multiple rear flank gust fronts in a lot of tornadic storms that we're observing. For example, this one over here is just in the middle of the screen, where here's where the tornado would be located, and you have this primary rear flank gust front that's sticking out around here. Out here to the right is where the ambient air is located. But inside of this outflow air, there's this secondary band that you see, and it's leading this surge of rear flank downdraft. So you had originally some rear flank downdraft, or some downdraft that dumped out this outflow, and then you get this kicked up outflow and downdraft that's surging and has this leading edge of vertical motion ahead of it. These are just random snapshots from a handful of different articles in the literature suggesting that maybe several tornadic storms have this feature. And some of these studies, this one here in particular, this is the Goshen County, Wyoming storm, famously observed during Vortex 2, have shown that tornadogenesis seems to happen at about the time that this rear flank downdraft surge reaches the ground, suggesting that they're actually maybe pretty important for kicking up tornadoes, at least in some cases. So if we modify our diagram that we started with here over to the left to include maybe some new items, here we add on this rear flank downdraft surge, and this attendant gust front leading it that's sort of, wrapping around the area of the tornado and the low-level mesocyclone. I think we've also kind of noticed in observations, at least I have, that instead of this kind of tight forward flank gradient that Lemon and Doswell proposed, it tends to be rather diffuse. The baroclinic gradient across here tends to be several kilometers wide. It's not some tight, narrow little thing that you see like in the rear flank of the storm. And updraft and convergence along this area, particularly as far as you get farther and farther away from the main updraft, it tends to be pretty diffuse actually. Parcels as they cross this barely rise up more than a few hundred meters if that. And also in the last probably 10 or so years, there seems to be a lot of attention paid to some numerical simulations that have, in addition to whatever a diffuse forward flank, I call this convergent boundary here, used to be generic, as other forward flank boundaries, particularly those that might be a little closer to kind of the precip core or the rear flank downdraft area, that some people suggest might be kind of focal points for streamers of vertical vorticity that are coming into the tornado. Most of what I'm going to talk about here today is focusing basically on this region right here, so I'm not talking too much about this or very much about this, but mostly about behavior of these rear flank downdraft surges and the mesocyclone and the updraft and downdraft kind of all located around the tornado after the tornado was formed. And I'm sure everyone probably knows the Markowski et al. 2002 study. So they're suggesting, and some others have, studies have come out that support this pretty well, that the thermodynamic structure in the mesocyclone itself seems to play a pretty prominent role in tornadogenesis, where they see that weakly tornadic storms and non-tornadic storms tend to have these really cold outflows in the hook echo region of the storm, whereas significantly tornadic storms tend to have relatively warm outflows. And the assumption here in some supporting simulations by Markowski suggests that the cold air down at low levels is cold means dense, right? So if you impose some storm scale updraft on it, it'll be more difficult to lift the more dense air than it is the less dense air, so it's more difficult to contract that angular momentum at low levels. And this is at tornadogenesis. Not necessarily what happens after the tornado forms, which is going to be something that we're going to talk about today. So assuming you're a supercell and you get just the right outflow temperature in your mesocyclone, you get just the right amount of baroclinic generation in your forward flank, you get just the right amount of updraft and just the right amount of downdraft, possibly with a downdraft surge, all at this one precise time. Mazel tov, it's a bouncing baby tornado, spinning baby tornado. Then what happens? Well, all of these specific set of conditions that all came together at this one time to make a tornado, they keep on evolving, and so does the tornado. And so what I'm going to talk about today is in the last 10 or so years, I've looked at tons of dual Doppler supercell analyses using mobile Doppler, Doppler on wheels radars. Also some high resolution 500 meter, that's what we'll call high, WRF simulations that assimilate a lot of these observations to really just dissect the heck out of storm scale processes going on after the tornado has formed. See what roles these storm scale processes, how they're evolving, what they feed back on the evolution of the tornado itself. And I'll kind of be jumping around all sorts of various topics. Hopefully I'll be able to keep up with myself as I jump around and skip around. So where to start if we have all of this kinematic data to analyze and some thermodynamic data to analyze, where on earth do we begin? I guess maybe we can start with just the fundamental building blocks of tornado, and say low-level angular momentum and low-level vertical velocity. If we assume that we have some amount of converging inflow and some amount of angular momentum to tap into, and boom, you've got your tornado. I guess we could assume that if either of those two ingredients changes, there's going to be some responding change in the strength of the tornado. So if the convergence stays the same but the mesocyclone weakens, the tornado should weaken. If the convergence weakens but the mesocyclone stays the same, the tornado should also weaken. So what I have here this is an analysis of 4 dual Doppler analyzed storms. The bottom row is a raw metric for the velocity of the tornado measured just with single Doppler. So it's called delta V. It's just the difference between the maximum inbound and outbound radial velocity of a radial velocity couplet down near the ground. So this is a time sequence of 4 different tornadoes. And the middle row here, this is an analysis in time of angular momentum within the mesocyclone. That's what's gray shaded here. And then the red and blue lines, these are a measure of the average convergence, which is red, or divergence, which is blue, within the mesocyclone. The y-axis here is doing this calculation as a function of expanding radius from the center of the axis of rotation. So the higher you go up on this diagram, the kind of wider and wider spatial scales you're looking at. For mesocyclone, we probably want to look somewhere maybe in like the 1 to 2 kilometer radius or so. So kind of where do we begin? I guess what we're trying to do is correlate changes in the wind speeds of the tornado with changes of the angular momentum or convergence in the mesocyclone. And I've kind of added you can sit here and dissect this for probably hours. I'm not going to subject you to that. I've added this tiny little cheat sheet down at the bottom, just subjectively correlating the temperature, or the rotational wind speed in the tornado with either updraft, so convergence or divergence, or the angular momentum. If you want to pick a storm to start with, you can start over here on the left, and you see that the tornado is kind of trucking along at its steady speed, and then it suddenly starts to die off. If I add a little more time here, you would have seen it basically plummet to 0 after about a minute or 2 after this final time. But you can see that this change in tornado intensity happens as this radial inflow just suddenly stops. It's kind of hard to see the shading here, but you may also be able to detect there's kind of this change, downward trend in angular momentum also at this time. So basically all of these 2 processes that are making this tornado kick up just decided to end at some point, and then the tornado dropped off. So angular momentum correlate, yes. W correlate, yes. Pick the one over here maybe on the far right, where you have the tornado that is cranking up in intensity. It levels out at some point here, and the point where it levels out and starts to drop off is where you switch from radial inflow to radial outflow in the mesocyclone. So correlation with W, seems like it. There does not seem to be much of a correlation in the change in the angular momentum though, because there's basically no change in the angular momentum at these smaller scales. If you wanted to broaden this to a wider scale, you can actually see angular momentum in the mesocyclone is increasing, which is kind of interesting, but that's pretty big spatial scales. I think we want to look a little smaller down here, where angular momentum is pretty flat. So it doesn't seem to be a qualitative change in the angular momentum. These 2 other storms here, the W pattern with this is so messy, I don't even know what to do with it. So we're just going to say that this is a thing that the Riddler exposed Batman to, trying to solve the riddle. And I failed. I failed. Yes, I'm Batman. But there does seem to be some correlation with the changes in angular momentum. Angular momentum is kind of slowly dropping off at a time when the tornado is starting to slowly drop off. And then this last storm here, it's a very short-lived tornado. Doesn't seem to be much of a change in the angular momentum. Maybe it's actually slowly increasing throughout the time, and the tornado spins up very weakly and dies all in just a few minutes. And I guess, no, technically for W, there's lots of radial convergence before the tornado even forms, but basically throughout the entire life cycle of the tornado, the whole mesocyclone switches to divergence and downdraft, which is kind of interesting. One more example, these were all dual Doppler analyses. This is one of these 500 meter wharf simulation analysis of the Goshen County storm. Plotted slightly differently than what's here. This is as a function of radius, but here is just at a fixed radius, but as a function of height. So the angular momentum here is in the mesocyclones building up during the time of tornadogenesis, and it's dying off during the time of tornado weakening, so it's tempting to say, hey, there's correlation there. W in the mesocyclone is quite positive through genesis and quite negative during weakening. So sure, both of these seem to correlate, except for this kind of messy part here in the middle, which is the part that we're caring about today, is after genesis, as the tornado is intensifying and maturing, the background angular momentum in the mesocyclone is actually decreasing, which is interesting. And there's kind of net 0 vertical motion through the updraft. really this is a function of the fact that we're averaging over a 3-kilometer wide disk, and there's as much updraft as there is downdraft, so there's some complicated 3D structure within there, so that's what's kind of making this look like it doesn't really correlate. But in terms of the angular momentum, the background mesocyclone is actually weakening a bit while the tornado is ramping up in intensity, which is kind of interesting. So go back to this slide for a second. If we had a bottle of tequila and pass it around, make everybody take a shot or two to get kind of blurry vision, or if you're not an alcoholic, you can just squint your eyes like I do. And notice, maybe you notice, if everyone squint your eyes and look at this panel across here, what do you see in terms of the gray shading? These middle two are darker, and these two are lighter, so there's less angular momentum in these two, in the outer two, than there are in the inner two. And interestingly, the inner two are the weaker tornadoes. The outer two are the stronger tornadoes, and they have less angular momentum in the mesocyclone to tap into, which is kind of trippy. While I was looking at this, I decided to poke through the literature a bit of other people that have analyzed tornadic storms, non-tornadic storms, weakly tornadic storms, and try to get an idea for what's the spread of angular momentum across all of these mesocyclones. And it was kind of hard to do. You're sort of at the mercy of what they present or what data they have available. So I tried to kind of collate a bunch of values here based on heights that are roughly the same above the ground, 500 to 1,000 meters or so. Radius from the axis of rotation, that's maybe 1 or 1.5 kilometers. And ideally be able to get all of these values at one time representative of some process going on in all of the supercells, but everyone kind of presents just what they have available. Some of these are from tornadogenesis time, some of these maybe after tornadogenesis time, or some average thereof. What's kind of interesting, and yes, this is my biggest experiment in color theories, let's see if this orange shows up, it sort of does, is the non-tornadic supercells seem to have values of circulation in their mesocyclones that are not dramatically different than the strongest tornadic supercells. They're a little bit stronger down here, but certainly neither of these match up to the weakly tornadic supercells that just have gobs and gobs of angular momentum in the mesocyclone, which is very interesting. I guess this suggests that these kind of weak, short-lived tornadoes are a product of there just being way too much angular momentum in the mesocyclone. It spins up some transient thing, and maybe there's just not good supportive low-level updraft or downdraft structure to really keep them going. And compare the strong tornadic and the weaker tornadic. The values, yeah, maybe they're slightly stronger here down in the stronger tornadic storms, but they're not radically different. And maybe this is just a function of tornadoes. Strong tornadoes can exist when you have this developed, nice, stable updraft, downdraft structure that non-tornadic storms very often don't have. So it's basically the same amount of angular momentum, you just can't tilt or stretch it in the non-tornadic storms. Just kind of food for thought, I guess. I'd love to do a more rigorous quantitative analysis of this, but I have to go ask all of these people for their data, and I'm just way too lazy for that. So revisiting a little bit, do changes in the background mesocyclone angular momentum correspond to tornadoes? It goes somewhere between maybe and probably. We have maybe some circumstantial reason to believe that the amount of angular momentum in storms doesn't really seem to matter quite as much maybe as the updraft. So changes in the updraft, it seems a little more likely to me that those would correspond to changes in the tornado. But everything that we showed here, these last couple of slides, these are all based on these kind of axisymmetric averages within the mesocyclone, and basically ignoring the full 3D processes that are going on in these storms. And so the rest of the talk, we're just going to talk about complicated 3D processes going on in storms and see how they're affecting changes in vertical motion at low levels, angular momentum at low levels, and how these might correspond to changes in the tornado intensity. Dramatic pause. So lots of studies suggest, like I said before, that the low-level vertical vorticity for mesocyclones, if not also for tornadoes, is this generation of baroclinic vorticity coming in from the forward flank. So if we want to try to understand changes in angular momentum in the mesocyclone, my first stab was let's try to understand changes in the forward flank region of the storm as parcels are coming through it. So using these 500-meter WRF simulations that are simulating all of this Doppler on wheels data to try to reproduce the storm as best as possible, what I did was track just wave after wave after wave of parcels that enter the mesocyclone or approach the mesocyclone at the time of tornado genesis, tornado intensification, tornado maturity, and the time when the tornado is weakening. I've only just showed these 4 here, but I've also done it basically every 2 minutes throughout the life cycle, the 30 or 40-minute life cycle of this tornado. You see that in all these examples, the majority of the parcels, with the exception of a few strays, they're coming in from the environment, coming across this forward flank baroclinic region, and then hit the edge of the mesocyclone. So for each of these parcels, I calculated the baroclinic horizontal vorticity generation along them on their way to the mesocyclone. I stopped them when they reached the edge of the mesocyclone because in these analyses, these simulations that we have, they're not really high enough resolution to actually resolve the tornado or the sub-mesocyclone scale stuff very well. So kind of just cut it off there once we got to the most violent parts of the storm, which is kind of a bummer. The most violent parts of the storm is what we care about the most. So we have plotted up here each of these little black dots. This is an individual parcel coming in and its value of horizontal vorticity, or specifically baroclinically generated horizontal vorticity, right when it reaches the edge of the mesocyclone throughout the life cycle of the tornado, pre-tornadic through tornado maturity. So think of this as this is the rate of change of the amount of horizontal vorticity coming in that the low-level updraft can feasibly tap into to generate vertical vorticity for the mesocyclone and or the tornado. Let's see what happens. So you can see that if you squint your eyes again, another shot of tequila again, you can see that there's maybe this kind of rough linear trend of an increasing amount of available horizontal vorticity that the mesocyclone or updraft could tap into from the time of genesis through the time of maturity. Ignore this little drop here for a second. So it's very tempting to say, hey, the amount of vorticity coming in seems to correlate with the increase in the tornado strength. That's kind of cool. But this is the same case that we just described a few slides ago, where the background mesocyclone angular momentum is decreasing throughout the life cycle of the tornado. So the larger scale angular momentum is actually decreasing, even though more horizontal vorticity is being fed into it to be able to, which could be tilted and stretched. The smaller scale angular momentum seems to correlate with this fairly well. The bigger scale doesn't. Anyone have any ideas as to why? Because if you do, I'd love to hear them, because I don't know either, and I've been staring at this for about 2 or 3 years. My intuition is that if we're looking at this big scale flux of parcels into the mesocyclone, it should be able to describe this big scale production of angular momentum. I guess what's happening is that maybe there's just not quite enough updraft to tilt, or not the appropriate updraft or flow structure to tilt this horizontal vorticity such that the mesocyclone can take advantage of it. But interestingly, maybe the tornado is. Or alternatively, this could be saying that this analysis was just a terrible waste of my time, which probably was. And that what's going on to really ramp up this tornado is on a smaller scale than the mesocyclone, but a larger scale than the tornado, and a scale that we're just not really resolving here very well at all in these simulations, which is quite possible with a 500-meter grid spacing. But getting back to this jump here, this jump down here, during the transition from maturity to tornado weakening, you say, hey, this is an obvious correlation. It ramps up as the tornado is increasing and then suddenly just drops off when the tornado starts to die. What on earth is happening here? This could be physical, or it could be entirely analysis artifact. So what I did to produce these are these WRF simulations where I'm ingesting this Vortex 2 radar and in situ observations. And unfortunately what happens is at about, not this time, but somewhere around here, a bunch of instruments undeploy, and they just drive down the road in order to redeploy as the storm continues to move on. So it's sort of getting right out of their range, and they're going to redeploy on it. So also what happens right here, at about the exact same time, is the breadth of the forward flank baroclinic area shrinks. It just, instead of being, 20, 30 kilometers long, it suddenly becomes 15 kilometers long. We don't, because instruments undeployed, we don't have the data to actually verify that this shrinkage is true, or it could actually just be that since we just started depriving the model of data, the model did whatever it wanted to, and it did something screwy and wrong, and shrunk the forward flank downdraft area unphysically. So either way, unfortunately, this jump or this drop down here is kind of unverifiable. I'll let you decide whether you want to believe it or not. And if you come up with compelling reasons to believe it, please tell me, because I'm tired of looking at this figure. So there's a bit about some changes of angular momentum, how they might correspond to storm scale aspects. Now we can jump into maybe the more fun part, is the low-level updraft. How does this evolve after Genesis, and what roles does it play in augmenting tornado strength? So just to start, I kind of decided to back up a little bit and tried to see how the low-level updraft processes may or may not be acting in concert with the mid-level updraft processes in the main storm core. To do so, I decided to do some more parcel trajectory analysis, so just like I showed down here, where parcels are coming in from the forward flank region. They reach the edge of the mesocyclone, this time at a time representative of about tornado genesis. And then I integrate them forward in time. And so these colorized dots here, these are the parcel locations above the ground. So the redder you are, the higher you are above the ground. And you can see those parcels come in at the time of tornado genesis. They hit the mesocyclone here, this kind of rough green circle. And then they just propel or launch up into the updraft. They're getting higher and higher and higher, and you can actually, in some of these, you can actually kind of get the sense that they're actually spinning as they go up, which is kind of awesome to look at. Just a few minutes later, 10 minutes later, the time representative of when the tornado is intensifying, we do exactly the same thing. We watch these parcels come in, they reach the edge of the mesocyclone, they start to spin around in it, they rise up a bit, start to spin around a little bit, but a lot of these actually then seem to fall back down into the outflow, spill forward, and then rise up along the rear flank gust fronts, instead of rising up into the updraft immediately surrounding the tornado. It's kind of, a lot of stuff is plotted in here, it's kind of hard to see some structure. If we do this for a couple more times when the tornado is its most mature, parcels come in, they start to spin up, and here you can plainly see they spin up a little bit more, and then they just give up, they fall down, spill out into the outflow, and rise up higher along the rear flank gust front. And then at a time of tornado weakening, they come in, they spin up, they maybe get up to about a kilometer or so above the ground, then they just give up. They fall down and spill out of the outflow. They don't even try to get up into the updraft after that. So I think it's kind of interesting that the one and only time that the low-level updraft and the mid-level updraft, at least in this storm, using these analyses that maybe don't fully resolve everything below 500-meter grid spacing, the only time that these two are acting in concert, whether that be they're dynamically linked or maybe they're just coincidentally sort of feeding into each other, is at the time of tornado genesis. After tornado genesis, the low-level updraft and the mid-level updraft are comparatively not really talking to each other anymore. And the tornado doesn't seem to care. It just seems to care. It's very selfish. All it cares about is the updraft that's getting fed through it. You're basically at its representative altitude. It doesn't care about what's happening 3 or 4 or 5 kilometers above the ground quite so much, at least not directly. So there's one kind of interesting change, what happens in the storm at genesis versus what happens afterward.
Jim,
Well,
have you thought about this in terms of occlusion? Because it just does, tornado shifter, it seems to me that things reach maturity right about the time occlusion occurs, and that, like you say, the tornado kind of then has its own updraft in life, whereas the new meso forms downstream. Maybe that's where that vorticity is going.
Hold that thought.
Yeah, okay.
Don't get some gust front leading them. Actually, maybe a good thing for a tornado in a lot of cases. Really, the important part seems to be that as long as the tornado isn't surrounded by downdraft, as long as it just has some, which is intuitive, as long as it has some updraft attached to it from the storm scale, it seems to be a good thing for it, regardless of whether it's warm or cold. And warm downdraft just as bad as cold downdraft, as you would intuitively expect. And that's all I got. Thank you very much. That's what I would guess.
Great stuff, by the way, and I've referenced actually your 2016 paper frequently in a lot of the training material we'll do, but I know this is post-Genesis, but one thing that's very obvious in a lot of this, and it's hard for, I think, warning meteorologists and weather services to divorce themselves of this concept, is that the strength of the low-level mesocyclone does not show any consistent trend towards increased probability of genesis. Now, after that, maybe we can make some arguments, but there's this concept that the stronger the mesocyclone, the greater the probability. Now, which obviously dynamic stretching, et cetera, but you know, I can find just as many cases where the mesocyclone looked the same as a non-tornadic event. And so it's just very interesting to see that in more and more cases where it's not a one-to-one relationship.
No, it's not, and even just this past year, I've looked at storms, it's just very anecdotal on radar scope and said, oh, that's a hell of a mesocyclone, and then there's the best report that comes out of it is like, oh, 2-inch hail.
Yep.
And there's just no tornado at all.
Yep.
Where I would have been like, oh, that should be tornado warrant. And
Yep.
it's like, nope.
Yep.
Going through this stuff, I kind of started to seed of something in my mind. So keep this in mind. So the temperature schematic here of a bunch of storms, and then the angular momentum of a bunch of storms. Kind of what I was wondering is like, I don't think this is necessarily true. It's certainly not a good, robust conclusion. But if you have these kind of weekly tornadic storms that have tons of angular momentum, is it maybe because their outflow is also really cold? So you have a lot of mass and a lot of centrifuging kind of going on. But that said, these are also really cold, but have a lot less angular momentum in them. So I think it's just kind of a storm by storm sort of a thing, with a lot of whatever 3D flows going on. It's complicated, basically in each case. I think we'd need, I don't know, 30 dozen more of these and 30 dozen more of these in order to try to get legit statistics on it.
Thank you.
Could you go back to the tequila slide?
Which one?
For our eyes, and you noted that the momentum.
This one?
Yes. So the other thing that stood out to me when we did is the contours. It seems in the more strongly tornadic cases that, and I'm not sure exactly what's being represented there, but is it convergence? It seemed to be down low. You have these red contours in the.
Yeah. So like you mean like the scales that they are like on the y-axis, like how close they are to the.
Yeah. Right.
Right, so what sort of stinks is that the resolution of these analyses, basically anything that's sort of here or below, which would be, tornado or tornado cyclone kind of scales, we don't really resolve very well. I think you need, both because the radars are, 10 or 15 kilometers away at a lot of points, but also because you need to do smoothing in order to make the dual Doppler analysis. So like scales of this small are not quite as well resolved as scales, as you approach 1 kilometer and more. In principle, yeah, if what we seemed like we should probably want to correlate between tornado strength, which, tornado is this scale, we probably want the scales that are kind of in here or something like that, as opposed to scales that are out here that we've been looking at. Unfortunately, we're basically trying to look as close to this axis of 0 as we can before we start to think that maybe we're not resolving them as well in the raw data.
I guess what I'm trying to connect in my head is, as we've gotten further along in our understanding of predicting tornadoes, that we learned that the 0 to 1 kilometer layer is so important, and it seems that might be showing up there. But I guess.
Oh well, okay. So this is radius, horizontal radius from the axis of rotation, not depth. So this one was depth. This is height above the ground. But this is actually just at 500 meters above the ground. This is just at horizontal expanding radius from the axis of rotation. So if I'm the tornado, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer, 3 kilometer.
Okay. I know enough just to derail it.
Oh.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions for right now. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much.